My Chinese Business, podcast number 9. Hi there, welcome to My Chinese Business, podcast number 9, or YouTube video number 9 for the podcast. As many of you notice, I take the audio track from these videos, put them on iTunes for podcast, and then I just put the videos online for YouTube so people have many mediums for which they can access this information, whether you want to read it on the website, watch the video on YouTube, or listen to it on iTunes. So just to get all the information out there. So any of you listening to the podcast right now that want to go to the website or YouTube, there's a bunch of different information. There's some YouTube videos that you won't get the information unless you see them. There's a lot of stuff on the website that there won't be videos made for, and podcasts, and the same thing with the podcast. I really go into explanation about the website and stuff like that. So this video or podcast will go with an article I wrote, 10 Things Said in Beijing, China. Now, if you want the full article, just go to the website, mychinesebusiness.com. But we're going to focus on a couple of the things mentioned in the article today. The first one is, I mentioned in the article about the word piaoliang and how they use that for everything. But when I was thinking about it after I wrote the article, I want to focus on something else. I want to focus on the word hen, which is very, hen piaoliang, hen shuai, hen pong, very pretty, very handsome, very fat. And they use the word hen or very in front of pretty much everything, because in their sentences you need that word to signify that it's an adjective before the adjective, before the descriptive word. And the thing is when a lot of Chinese people start talking in English, they directly translate. I mean, that's what we do too. Whenever Americans or Westerners learn a language, you basically just directly translate at beginning, and then once you start learning the grammar and how the native speakers speak, you start changing your sentences. But when they start to speak English, and actually if you're in China, not that many Chinese people ever get a chance to speak to foreigners. So even if they've spoken English for 10, 15, 20 years, odds are they'll still just directly translate from English or from Chinese to English. They'll put very in front of everything. Now, when you first get there, you'll probably think that everything's a big problem because it needs to be done, very quickly. This is very important. This is, a very big problem. Everything is just everything is said in a way that you think it's a life or death situation. Now, the problem with this is it's not really that big of a deal most of the time. I mean, there was many instances where I was working in my office with my Chinese partner, and she would just go, I would think would almost be ballistic with the whole, this needs to be done, this needs to be done, it needs to be done, very quickly, it's very important. And I would get it done as fast as possible. Excuse me. But then afterwards, after I worked with her a while and I was in China a long time, I realized that that's just how they talk. The stuff didn't need to get done. If it did need to get done, it didn't need to be done right away. It could be a little while. And once I start realizing that, and I started going at my own pace a little bit more, it got more comfortable. And actually it was funny because I kind of explained to her, in English we don't really use, very for everything. So when you use that word, please, when you speak English, when you use Chinese, I completely understood. But when she would speak English, please don't automatically use that word for everything. And to be honest, she still did, but I knew what she meant. I knew what she inferred, that it wasn't very important. It was just something that needed to get done. That was it. And I mean, this changed everything. So when you're in China, when you're working with Chinese, business partners or traveling, and you hear the word very all the time, very important, that just think of it being, important. Take out the very, and then that's the real definition or real significance of what the person is trying to say. So I found that very interesting, and I didn't write about that in the article online, but I felt it was something that needed to be talked about. So some other things I thought was kind of interesting that people talked about. People, I remember, complaining about gym class and how they didn't like it because it was hard to get an A in it. And I kind of laughed at this because growing up, at least I remember gym class being an easy class to get an A. All you had to do was, try to shoot a basketball or just try to run the mile in under 12 minutes or whatever the time the teacher set, and you get, an A and have your clothes washed. But here, they were talking about how it's tough, and I asked I asked them, some people, what parts of the gym class were tough, and apparently they learned nunchucks and some other martial arts weapons, kung fu weapons, in their gym classes. And they were actually telling me about how it's hard to, twirl the nunchucks properly or swing, the stick properly. And this was just the greatest thing ever for me, because I was just thinking how in the U.S. you could never have a gym class with nunchucks or any weapons like that. And if there were, I'm sure there'd be a tremendous amount of lawsuits. Yeah. Some other things were, a lot of Chinese girls were telling me about how they are very jealous of American girls because of how much freedom they think American girls have. And what was very odd was, this was 2008 when I wrote all this stuff down when I just arrived in Beijing, remember, was they were talking about Avril Lavigne, the pop singer, and how she does exactly what she wants, and how there's no one that tells her what to do. And this is another thing I laughed about, because if you really look at her, she's just, a tool of corporate America, more or less. There's people that tell her, you should wear this makeup, you should have these clothes. I don't know if she writes her own songs or not. I have no idea. I don't really know too much about her. But the fact that these people think she's completely independent, well, obviously that's not true. And so as soon as people told me that, I just kind of realized how much, censored they are in the fact that they don't really know on TV what's real and what's not real. What's designed to give a certain impression and what's natural in that way. But this also kind of goes along with the next thing I want to talk about, and that's learning history through reading U.S. history books. Now, when I first was told this, I didn't really believe it, or I thought it was an isolated incident. But then I talked to a couple people. Granted, these are all people who were, teachers and had pretty good English levels, but apparently it's quite common in China to try to learn history, even about China, through outside resources. And that's because of the fear that everything in China is censored. And to be honest, when I first got there, I assumed that the history books would be pretty similar, except for around the period of Mao Zedong. I figured that around, there'd be a 20 or 30 year time period where the history books in China and the history books in the West wouldn't really be similar, but other than that, it would pretty much be the same. Now this is pretty far from the truth. Over the next couple years, every place I traveled, I would go to the museums there, and Nanjing Museum, Shanghai Museum, museums in Shanghai or Hong Kong, museums in Xi'an. I went to in Harbin, museums everywhere throughout China. And what I realized was history in China, not so much at the time when Mao was in charge, but throughout the last couple, about 200 years, I would say, is completely different in Western history books from Chinese history books. And the difference is a lot of information is left out, and then also a lot of information is altered in the way in America for American to seem like the good guys and the West to seem good, and in China for China to seem good and the outside, the Western countries to seem pretty evil. And there's a lot of stuff that happened in China that in the West we've never really heard about. I'll just give a few examples right now, brief examples, because there's definitely going to have to be several posts later on that just go into a lot of the differences in history. For example, one thing that I never ever heard mentioned in any history book in the West was the 731 laboratory in Harbin, which was a laboratory set up by Japan to do medical tests on patients, live people, prisoners more or less. And these tests were giving them diseases, putting them out in the cold for frostbite, and basically all the experiments you'd hear about during World War II in Nazi Germany that they did on the Jewish people, but Japan had done them on Chinese people and American prisoners and many prisoners of war at that same time. And I'd never heard of any of that happening. Other things that I didn't really hear happening was I never heard about all the areas in China that were occupied and owned kind of by foreign countries until I was in China. For example, Qingdao was controlled by Germany, Shanghai, France and Britain, where else? Hong Kong. I knew Hong Kong was controlled by Britain for 100 years. But there's basically, China was kind of like a risk game almost, where all these countries came in and just dissected parts from it. This little part was controlled by Russia, this part was controlled by Japan, this part England, France. The country was just separated and divided. And I never really realized the Opium War and how much wealth England was able to take out of China during that time period. But that's kind of enough about that history. But I will go into a lot more detail another time. So here's some other things that I remember hearing. That a lot of people feel that they are very lonely, and they feel it's because of lacking either a brother or sister. I mean, many only children there. There's not as many as people in the West think, and most families have 2 children. If your first child is a girl, you're pretty much allowed to have a second child if you choose. A lot of families don't choose it based on expenses, because it is expensive to have a child in the city or the countryside. In the countryside, though, you will hear of most families having more than one children. But in the city, if the first child's a girl, you're allowed to have a second child. Also, there are situations where if your first child's a boy, you can have a second child, but that costs money. Basically, there's ways around it. If you want to have a second child now, it's pretty liberal. You can have a second child. I met some families with 3 children, but that was very rare. But really, the mentality there is to only have one child. You'll hear a lot of families saying they don't want a second child, or they only do want to have one child. And when I was there, a lot of my friends were getting married because about that age, and they just all said the same thing. They'll have one child and that's it. Some didn't even want to have children, but they were only going to have a child because their parents were going to pressuring them into having a child. But a lot of the people there I'd also meet said that they were lonely growing up, and they thought it was because they didn't have a brother or sister. And to kind of compensate for this, whenever they'd have a good friend, they would refer to that good friend as, "This is my brother, this is my sister." And this is also very confusing when you first get there, because you'll meet someone, they'll say, this is my brother, this is my sister, but you'll see the two people holding hands. And what actually it is just those three people have been good friends growing up, and two of them are dating. They aren't related to each other at all, but they just refer to each other as brothers and sisters because they have that close of a bond. And sometimes this is between cousins, they'll say that this is my brother, this is my sister, when it's really their cousin, or just a very good friend that they've grown up with their whole life. This is my brother. And they'll be the same age, same grade, everything, look completely different. But then once you realize that all they mean is, this is my close friend, it all makes sense. So, right now I'm going to leave it at that. If you want to see the other things on the list, check out the website. And I'm going to start kind of separating, I think, the videos and the podcast, making a little difference. But up until now, if you want, check them out. I have a new YouTube channel. It's My Chinese Business. Yeah, pretty clever, isn't that? And enjoy this podcast, and I hope everyone has a great day. And remember, like I said before, if you have any questions, please go to my website, email me, and I'll talk to everyone soon. All right, take care. Bye.